What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's the beginning of a new 40k season. Last week, a new Dataslate update has been released for the game, and we've already seen some results begin to trickle in. And so, it becomes that time of the year where we engage in baseless speculation regarding how powerful each army in the game is going to be. So let's dive into a 40k tier list talking about all the factions in the game and exactly where they end up. Now, as a little bit of context, this is going to be essentially a gradient. Moving from D up to S tier, what I'm looking at is the army's relative power compared to the armies that are next to it. Whether or not they end up in the bottom of D tier or the top of C tier won't make that big of a difference, but whether or not they are better or worse than the armies right next to them is going to be the clincher. Now, as always, one thing to keep in mind with these tier lists is that every army in 40k has the ability to win, and especially in 10th edition, that's basically never been more true than it is now. The relative balance of the game has been constantly improving, and while we do see some factions that are going to be at the top level and much easier to win with, that doesn't mean that factions at the bottom in D tier cannot beat them under the correct circumstances. Generally speaking, our factions that are near the bottom of the list will have a limited build variety and won't quite be as flexible as the factions that end up at the top of the list, where they're able to play kind of whatever they want and have a pretty solid matchup into anything. But you will probably see at some point over the course of the season factions do well even if they are towards the bottom of the list. So don't despair if you are a player of one of those factions. All is not lost. You just got to get good. And with that, let's jump into the list and talk about the factions starting at D tier. So starting at the bottom of the game, we're going to start with Genstealer Cults. These guys, unfortunately, were not doing quite so hot in the last season. While they did see a little bit of success, it was largely with a limited player base and extremely good players at the helm. And unfortunately, they did not really get much better. They saw no real mechanical changes, and unfortunately have ended up at a position where, while they're good at scoring and good at repositioning around the table, their army folds very quickly. And if you're able to kill it and they respawn into an awkward position, they probably aren't going to be able to get back in to a relevant area of the table. In addition, some of the other factions that we're going to be talking about at the top of the tier list, factions like Necrons and Grey Knights have incredibly powerful repositional effects. Being able to block deep strikes is going to be a big part of the metagame moving on into the future. So that's like Genstealer Cult's whole thing. They basically just want to be deep striking on you, and if everyone is taking anti-deep strike technology and millions of screening units to stop you from getting anywhere, that sucks for them. It's just a bad time for those guys. And unfortunately, unlike those other factions, they don't quite do it with the same efficiency that the armies that can uppy downy or jump around the table every single turn do. Moving on from that, we have another bit of a sad story. Adeptus Mechanicus will also place in D tier next to Genstealer Cults. Now, this is probably going to be a little bit not representative of exactly how good Adeptus Mechanicus is. The Skitarii Hunter cohort is unironically a really powerful detachment. It gives you the ability to run tons of infantry. They're super hard to kill, can fill the board, and even do a little bit of damage, especially against lightly armored enemies. The downside is that it's difficult to play, requires you to own like 150 infantry and multiple dedicated transports, and sometimes just dies if you have good infantry sweeping, or it doesn't go first and you're not able to pin your opponent in their deployment zone. Okay, Inky, come on. Outside of that, you basically have not too many playable archetypes. There are a couple lists that you can tinker around with, but without buffs to some of their data sheets or points values, I don't know if those are going to be relatively playable. Again, build flexibility is a big part of the faction strength in this tier list, and Adeptus Mechanicus, in my opinion, just don't really have that. They're just kind of stuck playing Hunter cohort. It's pretty good, but that's all they have going for them. Moving on through D tier, we have Tyranids. Now, Tyranids, I do think, has a lot more available variety than the other factions that we're talking about. Having a fully fleshed out codex is a big boon for this faction, and they have a lot of powerful data sheets inside that codex. Unfortunately, they also have a lot of very not powerful data sheets, and some of those data sheets even got points increases in the last update, despite the fact that Tyranids were not doing so well. Now, very much like Adeptus Mechanicus, I think Unending Swarm has been proven to be fairly effective, but a lot like Skitarii Hunter cohort, it is solvable, just an infantry skew, and with some of the factions at the top of the game right now, I think being very good against infantry skews, it's maybe not going to see the same success this season as it did last season. In addition, Gargoyles, kind of the main ingredient of that list, were also nerfed. They got a little bit of a points hike. On top of that, the most important data sheet, in my opinion, that is in the Codex, the Neurolictor, also got a significant points hike. It's not huge because you only ever take 3 of them, but it does add about 45 points to any Tyranid list that's running multiples of them, and that feels real bad. Tyranids were already kind of in the door doldrums last season, and I think generally speaking have just gotten worse this season, which is why we're putting them at the bottom. Now, in a similar spot is going to be Tau Empire, which is why we're going to put them at D tier as well. This is a faction almost entirely predicated on playing Crisis Battlesuits, and unfortunately the Crisis Battlesuits got a fairly hefty points hike in this new update. Their builds are very one-dimensional, generally speaking almost entirely based around getting up close and personal with your opponent and shooting them with cyclic ion blasters. If that isn't possible, or your opponent's able to punish that style of play, Tau Empire are looking pretty sad. Tau Empire do have some insane damage output, however, and some fairly reasonable faction mechanics. And while they did see some success last season, they were already existing kind of like Tyranids in this sort of medium of mediocrity. And having their most important and widely played unit getting a points hike, I think hurts the faction a lot overall. They did see some points reductions on their lesser played units, kind of like Tyranids did, and that's going to make their utility and support units easier to field, but I don't know if that's enough to pull the faction out of the lower tiers. To be fair though, Tau are also staring down the barrel of getting a new codex with a bunch of new units in the next couple weeks, so I don't know how relevant this rating is going to be for them, because they are probably going to be entirely redesigned as a faction like tomorrow, and if that's the case, then they'll have a lot more going for them. Now moving on, we're going to jump up to C tier. Now again, I'm mostly looking at these armies in terms of a gradient, so I don't necessarily assign any particular value to being in one tier or another. This is simply just going to be the next faction that's on the spectrum, and in my opinion, that is going to be Thousand Sons. Thousand Sons actually didn't see any changes whatsoever in the Dataslate update, but again, they were a faction that was doing just kind of okay, kind of like a lot of the factions that we're talking about in these tiers, and unfortunately got a nerf. Thousand Sons are based around very expensive infantry bricks, usually with attached characters. Unfortunately for them, that made scoring secondaries themselves kind of tough, because they didn't have a lot of points left over to take good utility units, and the utility units in the Thousand Sons Codex itself are not very strong. However, the Tzeentch units in the Chaos Demons Codex were pretty good. Unfortunately for Thousand Sons, the new Demonic Pacts rule has essentially nuked the faction's access to demonic allies. Whereas previously you could take units like the Blue Scribes or the Changeling and just slot them into your Thousand Sons list in order to add some cheaper lone operative objective holders. Now, not only are those units more expensive, but you also have to take Tzeentchian battle line units like Pink Horrors or Blue Horrors in order to unlock them. And given the fact that Thousand Sons already were paying a bunch of points for all their units, that's not very good for them. That makes it difficult for the faction to reliably score victory points. I will say, however, as a little bit of a caveat, some of their predators in the meta did get knocked down a peg. Factions like Chaos Space Marines were brutal for Thousand Sons, and lots of indirect fire often blew them up. And indirect fire platforms have seen a points increase, and Chaos Space Marines have gotten nerfed. So it may be that Thousand Sons end up at a higher slot than we see right here. It just entirely depends on how the rest of the metagame shakes up for them. Moving on farther into C tier, we have Astra Militarum. This is another faction that was doing okay. Astra Militarum actually saw a lot of wins towards the end of the pre-Dataslate season, especially with lists focused on Bullgrin and scout units that could take the center of the table. Unfortunately for Astra Militarum players, those were backed up by Manticores and other artillery pieces. And unfortunately, Manticores got a massive points hike, which I don't necessarily know if they deserved. It seems like Games Workshop wanted to take like the really easy PR win by just nuking all the indirect fire in the game again for like the third time. Astra Militarum, as the indirect fire matters faction, just got caught in the crossfire of that. I think that Astra Militarum still has what it takes to compete moving on, but it's going to be tougher for them because they are going to be paying more points for the same amount of damage, which is unfortunate for a faction that was already reliant on a small percentage of its army to actually deal damage to its opponent, because it had to put so many resources into actually surviving in the middle of the table. Moving on from here, I'm going to group some factions together when I discuss them, and these are going to be the Space Marine subfactions. Now, Dark Angels is the one I have at the bottom, but I will caveat this. The new Dark Angels supplement is just releasing basically as I'm recording this video, and we don't really know how well it actually performs in competitive scenes. In addition, we don't have an updated Munitorum field manual for this supplement, so it may be that it is much better than it looks on paper, because the points values in the printed supplement itself may be incorrect based on how Games Workshop wants to balance things. I think if Dark Angels end up having the points values that they do in the supplement itself, then they're going to struggle a little bit. Some of their units are kind of wildly overcosted, but if we see points cuts on those units, I actually think Dark Angels will bump up to the higher tiers of Space Marine subfactions. Now from there, I'm going to put Death Watch and I'm going to put Vanilla Space Marines, largely meaning Ultramarines, Marines, but we will probably also see some play from Salamanders. I'm going to put them basically together. Deathwatch and Marine results tend to be very similar to one another, and Deathwatch tends to be kind of a side grade from Space Marines proper. Now, Space Marines saw a lot of their most played utility units nerfed pretty heavily. Units like Scouts and Inceptors did get a points hike, although I think it is fair because those units were super strong, some of the best utility datasheets in the entire game. Paying a lot more points for them does mean that Space Marines have less points with which to shoot you with bolt guns and laser beams. Well, we did see some points cuts to their infantry unit. Their most powerful archetypes, especially being lists like Vanguard Spearhead in the John Lennon style that we saw from the World Championships of Warhammer, which became incredibly popular over the breadth of Space Marine lists, did see a lot of points hikes. That list was running, I think, 15 Inceptors by the end, so those going up around 7 points per model as a ridiculous points increase to the list. We also saw units like Aggressors and Centurion Devastators also go up, which is basically like every big infantry brick that the list had all went up in points cost. So that list got nerfed significantly. Obviously, Space Marines have a deep bench and they have a lot of other builds, which is why they're not lower on this tier list. I think that they're going to be able to recover fairly well, but the question of the day is exactly how well they do that. Now, I'm also going to put Blood Angels in here too. I think we're going to put Blood Angels right next to Space Marines. They may be a tier higher, probably a tier lower, actually, just based on the fact that vanilla Space Marines have access to Ultramarines characters and Blood Angels don't, but I do think Blood Angels and regular Space Marines at this stage are probably going to be sitting somewhere around the same level. Sons of Sanguinius saw a nice buff in the Dataslate update, and given that Blood Angels are slightly less dependent on vanilla Space Marine units, does mean that they don't suffer the points hikes quite as badly. They can still play detachments like Gladius Task Force, running Librarian Dreadnoughts and Death Company. Those armies didn't really change and are still going to be fairly effective. And with the Space Marine sub-factions dealt with, let's move on to B tier. This is the right middle of the road in terms of 40k armies. And the first faction I want to talk about here is going to be Imperial Knights. Now, Imperial Knights, I think, were fighting in the previous season for the very worst army in 40k. They did not perform very well. They were a hard skew list that got automatically countered by a lot of the other factions in the game, and they just weren't a particularly strong pick. That said, Imperial Knights being very dependent on their big, heavy, stompy knights meant that big points cuts to those stompy knights helps the faction a lot, and a lot of Imperial Knight lists have dropped 100 to 150 points. On top of that, they also got a buff to their Lay Low the Tyrant rerolls, and that makes them much more efficient, especially at taking their big, heavy guns that you oftentimes didn't want to take previously because of how inconsistent they were. But firing things like Thunder Coil harpoons with essentially full rerolls, thanks to that Lay Low the Tyrants, makes them a lot more interesting of an inclusion. And I do think Imperial Knights are going to see a little bit of a resurgence. Now, that said, they are going to be a skew list based around big stompy robots, and if the top tiers of the metagame end up being good against big stompy robots, that's going to be a problem for them. However, a lot of the factions that were excellent at blowing up big stompy robots got nerfed significantly. We saw Chaos Space Marines, probably the game's preeminent damage hose, get enormous numbers of nerfs. And we also saw Adepta Sororitas' ability to automatically lethal hit multiple huge damage Melta shots get nerfed as well. Aeldari have seen some nerfs to their enormous Wraithguard bricks that were absolutely disgusting against Imperial Knights. And I think all those changes together are going to help the faction significantly. Now, speaking of Chaos Space Marines, that is going to be our next one. Now, this is a really interesting faction to talk about because, like Space Marines, Chaos Space Marines have a really deep bench of playable units. They have a lot of good stuff, and the Dark Pact mechanic is a good solve for any unit in the army. Basically anything, as long as it passes its Dark Pact check and doesn't damage itself, does pretty reasonable damage, getting sustained hits or lethal hits. However, they saw some super heavy nerfs to a lot of their units, super huge points cuts to a lot of their units as well as mechanical changes to their detachment. And I think overall that is going to be hamstringing Chaos Space Marines' power. That said, there are a lot of builds in Chaos Space Marines that remain unexplored, and it may be that they're able to just spring back with no problem, focusing on heavily armored units, for example, or even their lighter infantry units like Raptors or Standard Legionaries. I can't say exactly where Chaos Space Marines will end up, but it is assured that they are significantly less powerful than they were before, which, to be fair, I think is okay because they were ludicrously overpowered in the previous season. season. Now, speaking of Chaos Space Marines, we are going to stay along the same line and talk about World Eaters. Now, World Eaters are going to be putting next to Chaos Space Marines because they were a faction that did pretty okay in the previous season, but a little inconsistent. World Eaters rely very heavily on favorable Blessings of Khorne rolls, as well as a lot of times going first. World Eaters are really good when they get the first turn. They can perform a large scout move. If they roll well on their Blessings of Khorne, get additional movement and advance and charge, and then just literally pin you in your deployment zone from the start of the game, lock all their objectives in with jackals, and it's just GG from there. However, if they don't go first, or you have heavy screening or good counter melee, which we are going to be seeing in some of the factions towards the top of this tier list who are very good against opposing melee armies, it might be tough for World Eaters to compete, especially alongside the fact that they saw significant debuffs to their infantry characters, to their enhancements, as well as points hikes on a lot of their most played melee units. While in some formats, and especially terrain dependent, there may be some World Eaters lists that are focused on their larger units and super heavies. Again, I don't know if that's particularly consistent, and what I would have liked to have seen is a little bit of a buff to Angron, since they got significant nerfs to the consistency of their favorite of Khorne rolls, and one of the biggest benefits that they're able to unlock is the ability to respawn Angron multiple times over the course of the game. And unfortunately, it's going to be much harder to do that now, which really reduces World Eaters' longevity over the course of a game. Once Angron goes down, it goes from being relatively consistent that he comes back once or twice over the course of the rest of the game to being kind of rare. That's really unfortunate for him. If he was cheaper, I would feel much better about it, but given how expensive he is and how much of a chunk of the World Eaters army he is, we may not see him on the table as much anymore, which is unfortunate because he's one of the highest threat range and damage output units in the faction. I think World Eaters end up with a big problem of able to project their threat into the enemy army if they don't have Angron in the list, and Angron is just kind of expensive and much worse than he was now. That's all unfortunate for World Eaters. Their game plan is still solid. Being able to pin your opponent in their deployment zone, beat them up with melee, and steal all the objectives is good. They just have less stuff with which to do that. And that moves us on to the rest of the Space Marine sub-factions. Now, we did see Black Templars see a ton of nerfs in the update. However, Black Templars were a little bit less reliant on the vanilla Space Marine units that we saw nerfed. And in fact, Black Templars actually may have some solid synergy with the Space Marine units that did get a discount in the January data slate. However, Black Templars units themselves also got huge points hikes, especially their characters. That said, these units are still efficient, and Black Templars still have some of the best melee units in the game in the form of Sword Brethren attached to powerful Space Marine characters. And most of the stuff that they play did not get touched too much. The standard Black Templars builds that were focusing on Primaris Sword Brethren and vehicles got a little bit nerfed thanks to the higher points value of units like Crusader squads, but is still a relevant playstyle, and Black Templars are still even able to move to their Primaris Crusader builds where they're taking hordes of Marines, which may be strong as well. Honestly, I still think Black Templars have the resilience to move on into the future. They're just going to be less powerful than they were, and given that they were probably an S tier or high A tier faction previously, I think that a solid high B is going to be a good spot for them. Now, in my opinion, a faction that was kind of a success story of the data slate update is actually Space Wolves. Space Wolves saw a buff to their Champions of Rust detachment, which, to be fair, I don't know is that relevant. I'm not sure that you're going to be taking Champions of Rust that often, given the fact that the vanilla Space Marine detachments are much better for Space Wolves than they are for even some of the vanilla Space Marine factions proper. But that said, none of the Space Wolf faction-specific units saw changes at all. In fact, getting buffs. We see Wolfen going from a laughingstock of a unit to being actually relatively dangerous with a mid-strength multi-damage hammer attack at an extremely good points value, especially given the fact that per point, Wolfen are actually significantly tougher than a lot of their vanilla Space Marine counterparts. On top of that, Space Wolves also have access to units like Fenrisian Wolves and Cyber Wolf that can act as small utility units and shore up the faction's reliance on support units that vanilla Space Marines all got points hikes for. Units like Scouts and Inceptors are great for scoring objectives, but Space Wolves didn't have to take as many of them because a lot of their backline objectives or midboard objectives, they could simply compete with those Fenrisian units. On top of that, Space Wolves even have synergy with units like Assault Intercessors that also got a points cut in the new update, meaning that I think Space Wolf armies, well, they are a little bit less powerful than they were previously simply because of the points increases are still going to be fairly strong. Now, for the last faction on B tier, we are going to be continuing with the Chaos vibe. Chaos Marines got absolutely hammered in this update. I don't know why they decided to singularly target every Chaos Space Marine with power armor, because that feels like kind of what they did. Death Guard are going to be the next one on the list here. Another faction that saw some pretty significant debuffs since the last update. Now, I think Death Guard were probably around this tier in the last season. They were looking pretty good and had some fairly solid success with a combined arms build focused on Death Guard units and a bunch of allies. It was probably somewhere around A tier and won several tournaments, but wasn't a dominating force. Unfortunately for Death Guard, their most common infantry unit, the Plague Marine, did get a huge points hike. And on top of that, Death Guard relied extremely heavily on allies, probably more so than any faction in the entire game, usually taking multiple War Dogs as well as Nurgling Swarms. Unfortunately, both of those units have been increased in value, and if Death Guard want access to any other units out of the Chaos Demons Index, they have to take Nurgling Swarms anyway, which they're going to do regardless, but they have to pay more points for them, which sucks. Death Guard did see some units get a points decrease, especially units that they were playing relatively often, although whether or not that is able to offset the increased cost of their mercenaries, I don't believe it is going to be the case. The faction seems fine. It just kind of sucks that they got like randomly caught in the crossfire of allies being nerfed, but such is the whims of Games Workshop balance, I guess. And that moves us on to A tier. The next faction we're going to talk about is Chaos Knights. We talked about Chaos Knights in the context of Death Guard, and while Chaos Knights' most commonly played unit, the War Dog Brigand, was nerfed, all of their other War Dogs remained the same, and most of their big knights got dramatic points cuts as well. Well, Chaos Knights now have a similarly limited access to allies, which is unfortunate for them. They're still able to take units like Nurgling Swarms just fine, and maybe focused on Nurgle Demons with the battle line requirements more than the other demonic allegiances, which I think puts them at a kind of fine place. Largely, I think they're getting side graded, which is why they're sort of sitting around this low A tier. Chaos Knights War Dog spam lists were somewhere around the B tier in the last season, and I think a lot of their natural predators have been debuffed a little bit, and they're incentivized to branch out a little bit more into taking one or two larger knight instead of multiple brigands. Their other efficient data sheets like Huntsmen and Carnivores are seeing some play and are looking fairly strong, and overall I think Chaos Knights are doing just okay. A faction that was a huge turnaround in this new season, however, is going to be Chaos Demons. Chaos Demons were another faction that was kind of fighting for one of the worst factions in the game in the previous season. They had okay data sheets, but were generally expensive, low on damage output, and kind of mid on survivability at best. What they do have going for them is an incredible suite of utility options and the ability to score points like an absolute fiend. No pun intended. That all feels pretty strong in this season, given the fact that this faction has been discounted to the tune of hundreds of points in most of your builds. All the greater demons and most demonic infantry all got points cuts. Many of their infantry characters got points cuts as well. And while we did see some of the ally units like Nurglings get a points hike, it's not too much, especially considering the fact that you're paying 20 or 30 points less for each of your greater demons that you're taking. So you're able to absorb those points cost increases fairly well. Unit volume is super strong in demons because they're able to jump those units into reserve, 3-inch deep strike them into enemy areas, steal objectives, complete tactical secondaries extremely well. Their unit efficiency was just not very good, but now I think it's looking a lot better. And with that in mind, I think we're going to be seeing Chaos Demons doing pretty well. Whether or not they stay at this A tier level or they get hit by a lot of the anti-deep strike effects that players are probably going to be jamming into their armies to compete with the super strong uppy downies that we're going to see at the top of the metagame is an open question, but Demons still have some good mechanics just generically to counteract that. They're not entirely reliant on deep striking, they just really like to do it, but they can just jump next to Bellicor with a rapid ingress and advance and charge the next turn and blow you out with a Bloodthirster with Argath or something. I'm excited where Demons are at. It's another faction that I very much like, and they look pretty strong in the new season and hopefully continue that way. Now, speaking of uppy downies and deep strikers, let's talk about Grey Knights next. Grey Knights were kind of middle of the road, but very, very strong in the hands of a good player in the previous season, and have largely gotten buffs. While they did see their Brotherhood Librarian increased in points value, those guys are really good, so I don't know how sad you can be about that points increase. On top of that, Grey Knights also got tons of really, really strong mechanical changes. Drago is able to use his ability out of Deep Strike. Nemesis Dread Knights can actually do significant damage to vehicles with their guns now, with high AP and ignore cover, as well as Brotherhood Apothecaries able to regenerate Terminators in their unit unit while in teleport assault. They can jump back to their battle barge, heal all of their buddies, and then jump back onto the table, making these already fairly resilient and efficient Grey Knight infantry units basically impossible to pin down. If you don't wipe the unit in a single turn, they're just gonna jump away and slowly regenerate over the course of the game to then jump back on your objective and steal it. Grey Knights are looking so strong in this new season. They were already somewhere around B tier before and are now just better than they were. Again, though, this is a faction heavily reliant on deep striking. If enemies start bringing heavy screens or omni-scrambler effects that prevent enemies from setting up near them, Grey Knights can be hamstrung by that a little bit. Now, moving on from there, we have Leagues of Votann. These guys are probably staying right around where they were previously. While they did see some points hikes, we saw some of their most spammable units like Sagittari ATVs get a little bit of a points increase. Nothing else really changed for the faction, but Votann actually had multiple pretty reasonable builds available to them. And they're simply going to move from one that is spamming multiple Sagittars to builds that were already looking relatively successful that are just going to be focusing on more of the heavier armored unit like Hekaton land fortresses, as well as their bikes like Hernkin Pioneers. Leagues of Votann are in a really weird position because they have probably what is the shortest list of datasheets available to them out of any faction in the game. And while those datasheets got nerfed, they still probably have some of the highest build variety, at least out of index factions, because they're able to manipulate the volume of those datasheets to take a bunch of different stuff, and all of it's relatively good. And so I think they're simply going to be moving away from Sagittar focused lists, probably to Land Fortress focused lists, which are just also strong. Pretty good spot to be in for Leagues of Votann. I think the changes in the last update that saw them get reworks on their judgment tokens and effects like that have made Leagues of Votann into a pretty good army, almost regardless of what they're actually playing. Now, speaking of reworks, let's talk about the next faction in the A tier here, Drukhari. Now, Drukhari, I will admit, are an enigma at this time because the faction has been essentially entirely rewritten from the ground up with the introduction of their new Sky Splinter Assault detachment. This isn't the first time that we've seen a faction rewritten to this extent, although it is the first time we see just a whole new detachment being released for them out of the blue. And while Drukhari were really struggling previously, another faction that in the hands of a good player could succeed, but it did require you to be very good at 40k, and not everyone can boast the title of super duper smart guy. With what is essentially an entirely new index worth of synergies to explore, I think Drukhari are going to be kind of a question mark for the next couple of weeks at least. I have a sneaking suspicion they're going to be good. Transports are really good in 40k right now, and they are the faction that has the best transports, so they're probably going to be able to score very highly and be super obnoxious to deal with on a base level, but their ability to actually kill enemies in melee and do damage has been significantly pumped up with this new rework, and all that together means that they're a faction that's going to shoot good, melee good, and be obnoxious to kill, as well as being fast and scoring points well, all of which together makes for powerful stuff. So I have a sneaking suspicion Drukhari are going to be a real contender in the new metagame, although obviously I could just be totally wrong because we haven't really seen them play very much at all yet. Sky Splinter Assault looks cool and fun though, so that's good for them. And with that, we'll move on to the end of A tier here and talk about Adepta Sororitas. Now, Adeptus Sororitas is a bit more of a known quantity, and while they have lost access to their super-powered Triumph plus Dialogus plus Palatine combo, which may mean that they have a tough time cracking armor, especially alongside points hikes to the Exorcist, they are still one of the best factions at scoring points. And they did get points cuts to units like Paragon Warsuits that are actually good at shooting people. Sororitas lists moving on into the future are going to have a much higher volume of units, given that some of their utility units saw some points decreases. Higher volume of units generally means that they're also going to be gaining more miracle dice over the course of the game, which also then means that they get to do more damage to you, assuming they roll 6s. You can also still just play the Palatine and Dialogus combo and get 2 Acts of Faith a turn instead of like 6. It's still fine, and it's still good at killing tanks, generally speaking, especially with light Battle Sister squads. That being backed up by efficient armor like Castigators and Immolators means that Adeptus Sororitas are looking okay. While they are less powerful than they were previously, I do think they're still going to be able to compete, and especially with good players able to use their utility units extremely well, this is going to be a contender faction for sure. And with that, we will move on to the S tier, where we first will talk about one of the biggest buffed factions in the game, Adeptus Custodes, moving on to the bottom of this tier. Now, this is another one that is a big question mark because we have yet to see how well Custodes do. I do think that a lot of the factions that were extremely good at killing them have been nerfed a little bit, and some of the other factions at the top tier here, factions like Drukhari or even Orks that we haven't talked about yet, but we will shortly, are very, very reliant on killing you in melee. And let me tell you about a faction that does not easily get killed in melee. It's one that has access to multiple instances of fight first in a single turn and can blender basically anything that touches them, meaning that they are largely, in most situations, kind of immune to melee attacks. So as melee gets more powerful as the edition goes on, Custodes themselves are also similarly going to get more powerful. They also saw massive points decreases with all their infantry dropping in value. A lot of Custodes armies get upwards of 100 points more to spend over the course of their army, which is pretty good. Able to put a couple more Witch Seekers or utility units in their faction, just making them better at scoring points. Going from a faction that saw significant buffs in the data slate, we will now talk about a faction that saw significant nerfs. That is Aeldari, although I don't believe that they were enough nerfs to drop them out of S tier, although they may not be looking quite as good as they have been in the past. Like Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines, Aeldari have an incredibly deep bench of datasheets to draw on, and so we did see some changes to their strongest datasheets. Aeldari can just take different stuff. Now, they did see some relevant changes to their core mechanics. Strands of Fate dice are significantly less impactful now, although you are able to build around that and take the Strands of Fate dice increasing units who give you access to more miracle dice that you're able to use over the course of the game. Whether or not that's worth it, I don't know, but that mechanic is less powerful than it was. As well as Phantasm being rightly nerfed, going from probably the best stratagem in all of 40k, hands down, no argument, to being, I don't know, probably just like kind of a good stratagem, I guess. It does mean that the days of Eldar relying on huge bricks of infantry and keeping them functionally immortal over the course of the game by jumping them in and out of line of sight during your opponent's own turn, they can't do that as reliably, but they can just take more lighter infantry, which has the additional effect of making their battle host unparalleled foresight rerolls even more effective than they were. Altogether, this means that while Aeldari has been nerfed a lot, they are still pretty good and have the ability to outshoot and simply out-efficiency a lot of other armies in the game. And especially at the hands of a good player who's going to be using their mechanics like Fire and Fade and the MSU style that they can bring to the best of their effect, I think Aeldari are still going to be an absolute powerhouse moving on to the future. And with that, let's move on to the next faction to talk about. We have Orks. Orks were already a faction that was very effective in the past season, and while they did see some points hikes on their most played units, they also got a lot of points drops as well. That can potentially move the faction from being a super strong light transport rush to being a super strong heavy transport rush with a lot of incredibly powerful and efficient vehicles, packed with boys who are incredibly good in melee. The big weakness of Orks, and one thing that may keep them down a little bit, is their relative inconsistency. To be honest, I hope that we see a change to this mechanic in the future to make it a little bit less one-dimensional, but if they do go second, their WA can be like wildly less effective. Not to mention the fact that being a predominantly melee-focused army, they do fall prey to the anti-melee armies. Factions like Adeptus Custodes are a real struggle for them, and while I don't think it's like an unwinnable game by any stretch, it is a pretty heavily uphill battle. Outside of those instances, however, Orks are just generically super good. They have tons of units that they can score with. They're incredibly aggressive, meaning they're usually good at primary, and in the vast majority of matchups have the aggression and threat range to push their opponent out of the game for the first couple rounds. Now that the other factions at the top of the game have been debuffed, as well as some of Orks' primary predators, I do think that they're going to be doing a lot better this season than they were. The Adeptus Custodes question is a real one for them, because I don't know if they have a super concrete answer, and that may keep their win rate down, but they have a solid game plan into most of the other factions in the game. A player with a good understanding of fight phase mechanics at the helm of an Orks army is like an absolute nightmare. I wake up in a cold sweat every night with Sean Naden's clammy hands grasped around my throat, slowly strangling the primary victory points from my list until I lose on scenario. We've started with many factions. What is this number? 25 factions? At first there were 25, now there is only but one, and that is Necrons. I think everyone kind of saw this coming. Necrons were looking very good in the previous season. Once their codex was released and fully unlocked by the player base, and they saw no changes in the balance update because they were released in such close proximity to it. That means we're going to be looking at 3 months or so of Necron dominance. Now, I will say, however, that I don't believe Necrons are going to be quite as dominant as other S-tier, top S-tier factions in the game have been in the past. Factions like Aeldari and Chaos Space Marines really just sort of like pushed other playable archetypes entirely out of the metagame in some instances, and I don't think that's quite the same for Necrons, although obviously I may be wrong and we may see Necrons become even more efficient as the player base plays them more often. While Necrons do have a couple solid detachments in their codex, I think they are mostly going to be reliant on Hypercrypt Legion. Canoptic Court is pretty good, but does have a little bit of a problem in the damage output category. That said, Hypercrypt Legion can put big, super crazy guns or Catan shards basically anywhere on the table that it wants them to be. And while it doesn't have a lot of resilience itself, they are so maneuverable that they will score a bunch of points. And given that points are how you typically win a game of 40k, that makes them very good at winning the game of 40k. Now, I don't know if the metagame has like entirely transitioned to fight the Hypercrypt Legion, and in the future, we may see much heavier reliance on Omni-Scrambler effects and tons of screening to prevent Necrons from jumping in and killing your stuff. And it may be that the metagame's able to solve the problem of Hypercrypt Legion, but I do think that the layered reserve effects that Necrons have access to make that super tough. You'll kill the Immortals on the swingback, but you already have lost the points, and that's unfortunate for you. Now again, build variety is a big part of this tier list, and I don't know if Necrons have a huge amount of it. There's probably like 2 or 3 playable archetypes that they have access to, and while Hypercrypt Legion can be built in a couple of different ways, all of which I think are interesting, they will probably end up relying on 1 or 2 for the most part. And I don't know if other varieties of Hypercrypt Legion will be quite as effective. And that means that the faction is potentially answerable. So moving on, later on into the season, we may see Necrons drop in their win rate, but at least looking at the first couple days of data, it looks like Necrons are dominant, at least for the time being. And that's why they're at the top of the tier list. So that's it, the tier list for 10th edition Warhammer 40k post-January Dataslate. This is all wild conjecture, so I might be totally wrong. I hope I'm not, but you know, who knows? No tier list survives contact with the metagame, as they say, so it could be that this entirely gets redefined as games get played. So let me know down in the comment section whether or not you agree with my placement of these factions, if you think I overlooked anything when putting these factions down on the list. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, makes these longer videos possible, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.